Islam, Authoritarianism, and Underdevelopment. AHMETT. KURU Part 2 History. 5 Crisis. The invasions, 12th to 14th centuries. From the 12th to the 14th century, Muslims experienced multiple and complex crises. 2 military invasions, one coming from the west, Crusaders, and the other from the east, Mongols, destroyed the urban infrastructure and the public order across a vast geography. These security threats had contradictory impacts on the Ulama-State alliance. On the one hand, the fall of most Muslim states, except the Ayyubids and then Mamluks in Egypt, and Berber dynasties in Morocco/Andalus, weakened this alliance. On the other hand, the perils of the Crusades and the Mongol invasions led many Muslims to seek safety from both the military state, as a possible protector against the invaders, and the ulama, as a provider of meaning to depressive conditions of invasions and massacres. Moreover, the Crusaders' emphasis on religious war resonated with similar sentiments on the Muslim side, further empowering the Ulama-State alliance. The invasions had also complex consequences for 2 other classes in Muslim lands, the merchants and philosophers. The Mongol invasion provided Muslim merchants with some opportunities by politically unifying Eurasia under the so-called Pax Mongolica. The Mongols also made some contributions to the natural sciences, for example, by patronizing the observatory in Moraga, Azerbaijan. Nonetheless, in general, both the Crusader and the Mongol invasions led to a deterioration of mercantile and scholarly activities in many Muslim cities. The Mongol invasions were particularly damaging in their destruction of irrigation systems and promotion of nomadic pastoralism. In this messy context, Sufism combined with Persian literature gained popularity in most Muslim lands. Meanwhile, Western Europe was protected from such destructive invasions after the end of the Hungarian and Viking raids and, later, the halt of the Mongol invasion in Eastern Europe. In addition to an expansion of agricultural production, Western Europe witnessed the emergence of a merchant class, particularly in the Italian city-states. Additionally, the separation between the Catholic Church and royal authorities became institutionalized, leading to deeper political decentralization, and universities began to be established, further challenging the intellectual hegemony of the Catholic clergy in Western Europe. This chapter will first analyze the Muslim world and then explore these Western European transformations. The invaders. The Crusaders. In the 10th and 11th centuries, Muslim Turks established states and conquered lands beyond the borders of the Abbasid Empire. The Karakhanid state was extended from Transoxiana to the western Darim Basin. The Ghaznavids took Afghanistan and parts of northern India under their rule. The Seljuk Empire defeated Byzantium at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 and opened Anatolia for settlement. Meanwhile, Western Christians also expanded their zone of influence through the conversion of Hungarians, Poles, and Vikings to Christianity. The expansion of Western Europe's military capacity and its ability to fight collectively became apparent during the Crusades, from 1095, the beginning of the First Crusade, to 1291, the fall of Acre, the last Crusader stronghold. The Crusades coincided with rising hostility between Sunni Seljuks and Shia Fatimids, as well as the internal divisions within both polities. In Europe, multiple socio-economic and political factors laid the foundations for the Crusades. Yet they could also be defined as, from the beginning, papal enterprises. The Crusaders occupied such important cities as Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, Acre, and Jerusalem, and almost entirely blocked Muslim access to the eastern Mediterranean Sea, except Egypt. Crusaders' anti-Muslim discourse intensified calls for jihad and anti-Christian sentiments among Muslims. Under these circumstances, Salah al-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, Saladin, r. 1174–93, who recaptured Jerusalem from the Crusaders, emerged as a military hero. Saladin also replaced Shia Fatimid rule in Egypt with a new Sunni, Ayyubid, dynasty. A few decades later, Muslims faced an even more destructive invasion, this time coming from the east. The Mongols. Having unified the Mongols and invaded northern China, Genghis Khan, r. 1206–27, marched in 1220 against the Khwarezm Shahs, who had replaced the Seljuks in Central Asia and Iran. The Mongols massacred virtually entire populations of some Muslim cities along their path. The reported numbers of murdered people in certain cities are exaggerations. Nonetheless, I will still quote them to give an idea about the levels of destruction and terror. Herat, 2,400,000, Nishapur, 1,747,000, Merv, 1,300,000, and Ray, 500,000. As another hyperbolic example, in the massacre of Gurganj, each of the 50,000 Mongol soldiers was reported to have executed 24 men, while children and young women were taken as prisoners. According to a more conservative estimate, northwestern and northeastern parts of Iran, including Nishapur, had a total population of about 2.5 million before the invasion. The Mongols destroyed or dispersed about 90% of this population. The Mongols defeated both Chinese and Muslim forces and perpetrated these massacres, though their army comprised only around 129,000 fighters, all cavalry, and their total population was about only 1 million. The Khwarezm Shahs had a larger army and population. The Jin dynasty in northern China had even a larger size in terms of both army and population. Nonetheless, the Mongols defeated both the Chinese and Muslim states by exploiting their internal divisions, using defected Chinese and Muslims with various skills, and continuously expanding their army with soldiers from different ethnic groups. Other reasons for Mongol military triumph included Genghis's draconian military discipline, effective intelligence network, and terrorizing by ethically unconstrained use of force. Barthold reports that Genghis sent a message to the Khwarezm Shah's ruler Muhammad, informing him that he sought peace with him and merchants should be free to travel from one country to another. According to Barthold, the trade interests of Genghis fully coincided with those of Muslim capitalists. Nevertheless, there was no such harmony between Muhammad's political ambitions and the interests of the merchants of his kingdom. Genghis also sent a caravan, including about 450 merchants, all Muslims, with merchandise. The frontier governor of Muhammad had all of them killed and the merchandise confiscated. In response, Genghis sent an envoy to protest and demand the surrender of the governor. Muhammad ordered the envoy to be killed as well. When Genghis marched with a well-prepared army to take vengeance, Muhammad made another fatal mistake. Instead of meeting the Mongol army on the frontier with a unified force, he divided the army among the cities in Transoxiana. Muhammad was probably unable to assemble his troops in a single place because his generals were not as docile an instrument in his hands as was the Mongol army in those of Genghis. Barthold observes three main weaknesses of the Khwarezm Shahs that made possible their defeat against the fresh forces of the nomads, united, under one of the most talented organizers of all ages. First, the effective political structure created by the Abbasids and further developed by the Tahirids and Samanids in eastern Iran and Central Asia gradually broke down. The bureaucracy no longer functioned well under the Khwarezm Shahs. Second, the ulama and some other segments of society held deep grievances against Muhammad. Finally, there was a rivalry between Muhammad and his mother, Turkan Khatun, who shared the authority over commanders. Against the Mongol invaders, neither Muhammad nor his mother showed effective leadership. It was Muhammad's son Jalal al-Din who led a vain but valiant resistance. After the death of Genghis, the Mongols continued their westward incursions into Muslim lands. In 1258, Hulagu, a grandson of Genghis, led the Mongol invasion of Baghdad, destroying its libraries, massacring its residents, and ending the Abbasid Caliphate. Hulagu's army also sacked Aleppo and began to march toward Mamluk Egypt. Berke, another grandson of Genghis, disapproved of this military act. Berke was the first major Mongol prince to convert Islam. He was the Khan of the Golden Horde, which ruled territories to the north of the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and Aral Sea. Berke was outraged by Hulagu's sacking of Baghdad and the killing of the Abbasid Caliph. He was also angered by Hulagu's expansion toward the Caucasus. In this context, Berke provided some support to the Mamluks against Hulagu. Hulagu had to return eastward together with the larger part of his army due to not only the military challenge of Berke in Central Asia but also the death of the Great Khan. A small portion of Hulagu's army remained to fight the Mamluks. At the vital Battle of Ain Jalut, 1260, north of Jerusalem, the Mamluks won a decisive victory, halting the Mongol advance. Timur. Starting with Berke, the rulers and people of the Golden Horde underwent a process of Islamization. The Golden Horde eventually became a Muslim Turkic state. Meanwhile, Hulagu founded the Ilkhanate in the southwestern territories of Khorasan, the rest of Iran, Iraq, and parts of the Caucasus and Anatolia. The Ilkhanid elite gradually converted to Islam and adopted Persian culture. Similarly, the Mongol state ruling Transoxiana and Eastern Central Asia, the Western Chagatai Khanate, gradually became Islamized and mostly Turkified, see Map 3. The Ilkhanate disintegrated by the mid-14th century. Timur, r. 1370–1405, a Turco-Mongol warlord from Transoxiana, filled the power vacuum and established an empire over the former territories of the Ilkhanate and the Western Chagatai Khanate. Notwithstanding his self-avowed Muslim identity, Timur sacked multiple Muslim cities and was responsible for the death of millions of Muslims in various regions including his own Central Asia. He weakened several powerful Muslim states, particularly the Golden Horde, the Delhi Sultanate, the Mamluks, and the Ottomans. Marshall Hodgson depicts the aftermath of Timur's massacres as towers of heads. Timur failed to fulfill his goal of occupying all former Mongol territories, but his conquests were as destructive as those of Genghis and Hulagu. According to Janet Abu Lughad, although the Arab Middle East survived the Crusader and the Mongol invasions, it seems not to have survived the depredations of Timur. The invaders and the decline. There has been a debate about the roles of Crusaders, Mongols, and Timur in Muslims' philosophical and scientific stagnation. In his rebuttal against Rena's argument about the incompatibility between Islam and scientific progress, Ottoman intellectual Namik Kemal, 1840–88, commented that the decline of Muslim scholarship was mostly due to the invasions of the Crusaders and the Mongols. Sayyid Amir Ali, 1849–1928, an Indian Muslim reformist, also regarded the Mongol invasion as a turning point in Muslim history. Rationalism, philosophy, the sciences and arts went down before that avalanche of savagery, never to rise again. More recently, Amin Maalouf argued that the Crusades led to long centuries of decadence in the Middle East. Assaulted from all quarters, the Muslim world turned in on itself. It became oversensitive, defensive, intolerant, sterile, attitudes that grew steadily worse as worldwide evolution, a process from which the Muslim world felt excluded, continued. In addition to this intellectual argument, there is also an economic argument about the destruction wrought by the invaders. According to the latter, the Mongols destroyed Muslims' dams, canals, and qanats and turned Muslims' agricultural lands into pastures for their own herds. This destruction and appropriation led to long-term agricultural and thus economic decline in the Muslim world. On the one hand, both arguments make sense in light of the damage the Crusader, Mongol, and Timurid invasions did to Muslim urban life. The Crusaders burned and plundered several libraries and schools, while the Mongols destroyed many of them too. The Mongol invasions resulted in the depopulation of cities and vacancy of previously cultivated lands, as a result of not only massacre but also the destruction of urban and agricultural infrastructure. In the arid climate of Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq, rebuilding complex water supply and irrigation systems was very costly. The agricultural and urban damage in these areas was thus particularly hard to repair. While the Mongols invaded the Muslim lands, Western Europe was ultimately spared a similar destruction. The Mongols reached Poland but then halted their westward expansion because their commanders had to return to their capital to elect a new Great Khan. According to John Saunders, this historical turning point facilitated progress in Western Europe while obstructing it in the Muslim world. Bloch also notes that until roughly the year 1000, invasions from the south, Muslims, the east, Hungarians, and the north, Vikings, had detrimental effects on Western Europe. But when the Hungarians and Vikings largely converted to Christianity, and the Muslim expansion in Spain and the Mediterranean islands ended, Western Europe was free from invasion. Hence, Western Europeans, unlike Muslims, enjoyed a unique opportunity for undisturbed, at least by outside forces, development. On the other hand, explaining Muslims' enduring problems as the result of solely foreign invasions has several weaknesses. After these invasions, Muslims achieved a geopolitical recovery. By the end of the 13th century, they took back all Levantine cities from the Crusaders. Crusaders intended to stop the Seljuk Turks' march in Anatolia, but after centuries of Christian campaigning, the Ottoman Turks still managed to cross the Danube. A similar recovery followed the Mongol invasions. By the early 14th century, the ruling elite of three Mongol Khanates of the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, and the Western Chagatai, converted to Islam. In the 16th century, there were three powerful Muslim empires, Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal. Muslims restored political order, military security, and wealth to rebuild their cities, including their libraries and schools. Until the European colonization, Muslims had centuries without foreign invasion. Hence, foreign invasions cannot solely account for the long-term intellectual stagnation in the Muslim world. Moreover, during the post-Mongol era, Islam continued to spread into new territories. The conversion of Mongol Khanate's elites cemented Islam's expansion into the Asian steppes. The Ottoman and Mughal empires extended the political and religious borders of Islamic civilization to the Balkans in the west and to Bengal in the east. In contrast to their early rule from Nile to Oxus, Muslims began to rule the area from the Balkans to Bengal. Thus, even if the Mongol invasions led to a severe decline in the agricultural fertility of Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq, this decline alone could not be the cause of a more general economic stagnation in Muslim lands, which had expanded well beyond these arid regions. Even Archibald Lewis's book, which presents the Crusades and the Mongol invasions as a turning point in the geopolitical rivalry between Muslims and Western Europeans, recognizes Muslims' recovery after these attacks. Lewis argues that in the year 1000, Western Europe was the most geographically remote and underdeveloped among 5 great civilizations of Eurasia and Africa, the other 4 being Islamic, East Asian/Chinese, Indic, and Byzantine Russian civilizations. Following the Crusades and the nomadic, mostly Mongol, invasions, he asserts, Western Europe ended up the gainer, while other civilizations weakened. Nonetheless, contradicting himself, Lewis acknowledges that by the end of the 14th century, Muslims still challenged European maritime ascendancy in the Mediterranean Sea, restricted Europeans' access to the Indian Ocean and Central Asia, conquered lands in western Anatolia and the Balkans, and managed to convert the Mongol ruling class in western Eurasia. He also adds, perhaps more significant, Islam had proved capable of penetrating other cultures. It had done so in India and Indonesia, southern Russia, and Byzantine Anatolia. And, the Black World south of the Sahara and along the shores of East Africa. Thus, from a geopolitical perspective, it was Islam and its civilization which ended up with the victory. For Lewis, this success is visible in Ibn Battuta's travel accounts. Ibn Battuta, 1304–68 was a Moroccan traveler. He dictated his memoirs, Travels, to a writer. It is arguably the biggest travel book ever written and covers nearly 75,000 miles in northwest Africa, Egypt, East Africa, Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Anatolia, Crimea, Central Asia, India, Indonesia, and China. Each of Ibn Battuta's 3 qualifications, as an Arabic-speaking Muslim, an expert on Islamic jurisprudence, and an advocate of Sufism helped him during such an intercontinental travel. Paradoxically, while Ibn Battuta's travels documents Muslims' geopolitical expansion, it also reveals their intellectual stagnation. Ross Dunn makes this clear by comparing Muslim indifference toward Ibn Battuta with European interest in Marco Polo, and even Ibn Battuta himself. In contrast to Marco Polo's book, which was widely circulated and acclaimed in Europe in the later Middle Ages, the Rihla, Travels, appears to have had a very modest impact on the Muslim world until modern times. Only in the mid-19th century, half a millennium after it was written, did the narrative begin to receive the international attention it so profoundly deserved. The credit for that achievement, ironically enough, fell to scholars of Christian Europe, the one populous region of Eurasia Ibn Battuta had never bothered to visit in his travels. The overall Muslim indifference toward Ibn Battuta's book was not an isolated event but a reflection of a broader problem. I will mention later how the works of Ibn Rushd and Ibn Khaldun also received a similarly tepid, if not apathetic, Muslim reaction until the 19th century. The rise of the ulama, the military state elite, and the alliance between them, at the expense of philosophers and merchants, were the main factors for this intellectual stagnation. The foreign invasions contributed to this process. Because of them, Muslims focused on security and survival and thus elevated the status of the military elites. In the case of the Mamluks, the military threat from the Crusaders and the Mongols led to a defensive militarization of the region that eventually undermined civil society and its vital economic institutions. Even the subsequent Ottoman, Safavid, and Mughal empires were affected to various degrees by the Mongol legacy of the military state. Moreover, the shocking massacres as well as religious discourse of the Crusaders motivated Muslims to further embrace their own religious discourses and support the leadership of the ulama. Despite these negative conditions, Muslim philosophical and scientific tradition had such strong roots that it kept producing first-class scholars for a few more centuries, as indicated in the following section. Waning of philosophers, from Ghazali to Ibn Khaldun. Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq. Chapter 4 explained how in the 11th century, several religious and political actors, particularly Ghazali, contributed to the establishment of an orthodox Sunni synthesis based on the integration of 4 Sunni schools of law and the exclusion of Shias, Mu'tazilas, and philosophers. This initiative continued in subsequent periods and successfully contained the political power of the Shias, eliminated the Mu'tazilas, and marginalized the philosophers in the Eastern Territories, Central Asia, Iran, and Iraq. The campaign against philosophy entailed material as well as doctrinal measures. For example, in the mid-12th century, the Abbasid Caliph Mustanjid ordered the public burning of Ibn Sina's and Ikhwan al-Safa's books stored in libraries in Baghdad. Nonetheless, between the 12th and 14th centuries, Eastern Muslim territories were still producing philosophers and Islamic scholars engaging in philosophy. One example is Fakhr al-Din al-Razi, 1150–1210. On the one hand, Razi attempted to reconcile reason and revelation. He studied medicine, astronomy, and geometry in addition to Islamic studies, especially the exegesis of the Quran. On the other hand, Razi made a contribution to the further consolidation of Sunni orthodoxy by promoting Ash'ari theology at the expense of Mu'tazili theology, and criticizing some of Ibn Sina's philosophical works. A more philosophically inclined polymath of the time was Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi, 1162–1231, who studied Islamic literature, including the work of Ghazali, philosophy, including works of Ibn Sina and Farabi, history, and medicine. Born and raised in Baghdad, he traveled through many cities, especially in Syria and Egypt, for about 40 years, seeking knowledge and patronage. In Cairo, Baghdadi met such important figures as Saladin and Musa ibn Maimonides. Despite their destructions, the Mongols still made an important contribution to scholarship by establishing the Moraga Observatory, where Nasir al-Din Tusi, 1201–74, studied and taught. Tusi gained this patronage through his services to the Mongols. The research Tusi and his associates conducted in the observatory influenced Muslim and European astronomers until the 16th century. In addition to astronomy, Tusi also wrote on such diverse issues as Shia theology, ethics, and politics. He wrote a defense of Ibn Sina's philosophy against the critique of Razi. The most famous student of Tusi was Shirazi, 1236–1311. Like his teacher, Shirazi was a polymath who studied a range of subjects such as astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. In the early 14th century, the Moraga Observatory became inactive. Nevertheless, the Ilkhanid rulers' patronage of scientists continued. An eminent student of Shirazi was Nishapuri, 1270–1328–9, who studied under this patronage. He wrote on astronomy, mathematics, and Quranic exegesis. Tusi, Shirazi, and Nishapuri were Shia Muslims. Their Sunni counterparts in Eastern territories had an increasing tendency to focus on Islamic studies at the expense of philosophy and the natural sciences. Two prominent Sunni scholars of the 13th century, Taftazani, 1322–1390, and Jurjani, 1340–1413, mostly concentrated on jurisprudence, Quranic exegesis, theology, Arabic linguistics, and logic. Taftazani emphasized human free will more than Ash'ari theologians normally did. Therefore, some scholars have considered his thought to be closer to Maturidi theology. In later periods, the Muslim world produced so few ulama of the caliber of Taftazani and Jurjani that these two scholars' books continued to be taught in Ottoman, Mughal, and, to a lesser degree, Safavid madrasas for centuries. Eastern territories were the beacon of Muslim intellectual life from the 9th to the 11th century. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, however, they lost this status to two other Muslim regions, Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia, on one hand, and Andalus and Northwest Africa, on the other. Abdul Latif al-Baghdadi's above-mentioned westward travel was a sign of the westward shift of Muslim intellectual dynamism. Egypt, Syria, and Anatolia. In Syria and Anatolia, several Muslim cities were occupied by the Crusaders. Some Syrian cities also experienced Mongol invasions. The ruler of Damascus, Nur al-Din Zengi, Arpoint 1156–74, emerged as an effective military commander and defender of Islam against the Crusaders. Nur al-Din opened Sunni madrasas in Damascus. These and other Nizamiya-type madrasas were funded by waqfs, which were private endowments. Nonetheless, they could not be simply defined as private or independent, because these madrasas fell under the doctrinal and political hegemony of the Ulamat state alliance. Michael Chamberlain documents that in Damascus, from the beginning of the Nur al-Din's rule to 1350, the great majority of the madrasas were established by members of households of rulers and officials. Despite the foreign occupations and the solidification of Sunni orthodoxy, scholarly productions continued to a certain extent in Syria and Anatolia. In southern Anatolia, Jazari, 1136–1206, wrote on mechanical engineering. His book of knowledge of ingenious mechanical devices surpassed the 9th century book by the Banu Musa brothers on the same subject. According to Hill, Jazari's book is probably the most important engineering document from any cultural area before the Renaissance. It is divided into 6 categories: 1. Water clocks and candle clocks, 2. Wine dispensers, 3. Phlebotomy measuring devices and water dispensers, 4. Alternating fountains and musical automata, 5. Water raising devices, and 6. Miscellaneous. Egypt was never occupied by Crusaders or Mongols, but it was still affected by the invaders' further militarization of the Muslim lands. In the 1170s, Saladin emerged as a military hero against the Crusaders. Initially he was a commander under Nur al-Din. He subsequently established the Ayyubid Sultanate, 1171–1250, in Egypt and later extended it into Syria. Saladin followed Nur al-Din's model of promoting Sunni Islam by founding Nizamiya-type madrasas in Cairo. In order to eradicate the legacy of the Shia Fatimids in Egypt, Saladin sold and disposed of books in that preceding dynasty's libraries, and especially those housed in the Library of Cairo, which was presumably full of heretical Ismaili books. Ruth Mackensen notes that Saladin's dismantling of the library may surprise Western observers accustomed to looking upon Saladin as one of the most enlightened gentlemen of the East. She explains the case both as the regular accompaniment of conquest and as an attack of orthodoxy upon a center of schism. According to both Mustafa el-Abadi and Bernard Lewis, the story about the Muslim destruction of the ancient library of Alexandria on Caliph Umar's order was fabricated in this context to provide precedent for Saladin's decision. Saladin's anti-philosophical measures also included his order for the execution of the philosopher-mystic Yahya Shirawardi, 1154–91, in Aleppo. Shirawardi was influenced by Plato, Aristotle, Neoplatonists, Ghazali, and especially Ibn Sina. Despite his execution at an early age after being accused of apostasy, Shirawardi's writings continued to be influential and became foundational for the Illuminationist school. Later Ayyubid rulers and ulama continued to take action against philosophy. Ashraf, the Sultan of Damascus, made a statement at the beginning of his reign, 1228–37, and prohibited the jurists from studying anything but hadith, Quranic exegesis, and law. He made clear that anyone studying logic and other foreign sciences would be banned from the city. As in other parts of the Muslim world, in Syria and Egypt, the decline of the natural sciences and philosophy was relative, not absolute. Muslim scientists and philosophers continued writing and teaching in various institutional settings. Some grand mosques in major cities had muwaqqit, timekeeper, posts, and thus provided research opportunities. In Damascus, Ibn al-Shatter, c. 1304–75, worked as the head muwaqqit of the Umayyad Mosque, where he built a famous sundial. Ibn al-Shatter developed some non-Ptolemaic astronomical models as well. Another important Muslim institution was the hospital, which contributed not only to the social development of cities but also to advances in medical science. The pioneering Muslim hospital had been the Adudi Hospital in Baghdad, built by the Buyids in 981. Later, in 1154, the Zengis built another major institution, the Nur al-Din Hospital, in Damascus. The famous physician Ibn al-Nafis, 1213–88, worked there. He then moved to Egypt, where he became a prominent physician. In 1285, the Mamluk Sultan established the Munsuri Hospital in Cairo, which surpassed earlier Muslim hospitals. According to the Encyclopedia of Nuwari, 1279–1333, in the Munsuri Hospital, physicians, ophthalmologists, surgeons, and bonesetters were appointed to treat men and women, and patients were placed in specialized wards with running water in most of them. Ibn Nafis bequeathed his house and library to this hospital. Ibn al-Nafis is known as the first scholar to write about pulmonary circulation, long before its detailed explanation by Harvey in the 17th century. Ibn al-Nafis wrote a theological novel, The Treatise of Kamil on the Prophet's Biography, as a response to Ibn Tufail's philosophical novel, Hay bin Yaqzan, Alive, Son of Awake. In Ibn al-Nafis's novel, the hero, Kamil, learns things like language, cooking, and wearing clothes from the visitors to his island, rather than coming up with them himself. The novel stresses the necessity of revelation and prophecy, in contrast to Hay bin Yaqzan's emphasis on humans' ability to reason truths on their own. In his analysis of Ibn al-Nafis, Naiyan Fancy tries to show that there was not an all-out repression of the sciences by religious orthodoxy during the 13th and 14th centuries. He is correct at the individual level. The fact that Ibn Nafis was a Sunni expert on hadith, jurisprudence, and theology indicates the potential compatibility of Sunni Islam and scientific inquiry. Yet this individual example does not disprove the connection between the rise of religious orthodoxy and the stagnation of scientific development in Egypt. Ibn Nafis did not have students or successors of his caliber, and thus his writings on pulmonary circulation were forgotten until they were rediscovered in the 20th century. Moreover, Fancy's own data indicate how religious intolerance hindered scientific development in the Mamluk Egypt. The endowment deed of the Munsuri Hospital explicitly states that Christians and Jews were neither to be treated nor employed there. This religious discrimination was probably motivated by the Crusaders' occupation of Muslim lands. Whatever the motive, the discrimination was morally wrong and scientifically counterproductive. It shows the difference between Baghdad between the 9th and 12th centuries, a cosmopolitan city, where Jewish and Christian physicians had career opportunities and science flowered, and 13th century Cairo was city constricted by Sunni orthodoxy, where non-Muslim physicians and Muslim philosophers suffered discrimination, and scientific endeavors atrophied and faded. Andalus and Northwest Africa. In contrast to Eastern territories and Egypt-Syria, Andalus produced its most famous philosophers in the 12th century. In the late 10th century, the Vizier Mansur, r. 978–1002, became the de facto ruler of Andalus. Mansur was primarily a military leader and organized about 50 raids against Christian cities in northern Spain. In order to gain the support of the ulama and the masses, he targeted the famous library built by the previous ruler, Caliph Hakam II, in Córdoba. In this attack, Mansur destroyed books on philosophy and various sciences, with notable exceptions. After the rule of Mansur, internal power struggles in Andalus resulted in its partition into about 24 small states, which facilitated the expansion of Catholic states in the region. In 1085, Toledo became the first major Andalusian city where Catholics fully regained control. A year later, armies of the Almoravids, a Muslim Berber dynasty, entered Andalus from northwest Africa and halted the Catholic expansion. The Almoravids ruled Muslim cities in southern and eastern Spain until the mid-12th century. The Almoravids allied with the Maliki ulama, constituting another example of an alliance between the ulama and the military state. From the mid-12th to the mid-13th century, another Berber dynasty, the Almohads, ruled Andalus and Morocco. The conditions of Christian and Jewish minorities in Andalus, which had already deteriorated as a result of constant warfare with Catholics and internal military struggles, severely worsened under the intolerant Almohads. In contrast to the Almoravids, the Almohads rejected the Maliki school of law. The Almohads had a puritanical understanding of Islam, which was paradoxically open to a wide intellectual perspective including elements of philosophy. Andalus produced eminent philosophers under both the Almoravids and the Almohads. Ibn Bajjah, known in Latin as Abumpes, circa 1095–1138, was a polymath who wrote on philosophy, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, physics, and botany. He influenced subsequent Andalusian philosophers. Ibn Bajjah's argument that living an isolated life of contemplation was essential for attaining happiness and perfection represents an individualistic emphasis, which would be fully developed later in Ibn Tufail's Hay bin Yaqzan. Ibn Tufail, c. 1110–85, was another Andalusian Muslim polymath. He served as a physician and advisor to the Almohad ruler Abu Yaqub. Ibn Tufail's novel Hay bin Yaqzan suggests that a human being living alone on an isolated island would be able to apprehend the meaning of life and the existence of a creator solely through observation and contemplation, without the help of any religious text. Thus, the capacity for self-teaching and even metaphysical philosophy was inherent in human intellect. However, the book also stresses that the uneducated masses, unlike the elite, are unlikely to grasp philosophical truths on their own, therefore, they need revelation and to be disciplined with the promise of reward and punishment. In the late 17th and early 18th centuries, this philosophical novel was translated into multiple European languages and read by several Enlightenment philosophers. Ibn Rushd. Among the Andalusian philosophers, the most influential was Ibn Rushd, 1126–98. As Chapter 4 discussed, many scholars have judged Ghazali to be responsible for Muslims' intellectual stagnation. They have also interpreted Ibn Rushd in opposition to Ghazali, primarily because of the former's rebuttal to Ghazali's critique of philosophers, the incoherence. A strong defender of this perspective was Jabri, who called for a revival of Ibn Rushd's thought to revitalize the Muslim mind with its rationalism and critical approach. It was Ibn Tufayl who presented Ibn Rushd to Abu Yaqub, a ruler deeply interested in philosophy, and commissioned Ibn Rushd to fulfill Abu Yaqub's vision of Arabic commentaries on Aristotle's works. Abu Yaqub appointed Ibn Rushd as a judge in Seville and then as the chief judge of Córdoba, where his father and grandfather had also served as judges. Ibn Rushd served the ruler as a physician as well. He wrote a large number of his treatises while serving in these public positions. Ibn Rushd promoted Aristotle's writings and was critical of the modifications of Aristotelian philosophy suggested by Farabi and Ibn Sina. Yet Ibn Rushd was not a simple interpreter of Aristotle. His Islamic beliefs resulted in an understanding of God, God's creation of the world, and God's knowledge that diverged from Aristotle's ideas on several points. As an Islamic scholar, Ibn Rushd tried to bridge philosophy and Islam. In Kitab Fazl al-Maqal wa Takrima bain al-Shari'a wa al-Hikmah min al-Itisal, decisive treatise, determining the connection between Islamic law and philosophy, he shows that pursuing philosophy is obligatory for Muslims, because several Quranic verses order the faithful to contemplate animals, the earth, and the heavens. In order to better understand God and His creation, Ibn Rushd argues, one needs to learn demonstrative, dialectical, and rhetorical reasoning, which requires philosophical training. There should be no contradiction between demonstrative reasoning and revelation. If a contradiction is perceived, then an interpretation is needed and must be achieved without destroying the linguistic framework of the text. The Quran, Ibn Rushd continues, explicitly states that some of its verses are symbolic and can be interpreted by those firmly rooted in knowledge. 3:7. It is normal, then, to see multiple interpretations, especially on theoretical issues, in different periods. Philosophers, such as Ibn Sina and Farabi, are among those firmly rooted in knowledge, and they may have certain interpretations that seem wrong to others. Even their wrong judgments are to be rewarded in light of a well-known hadith. If a judge makes a correct ijtihad, interpretation, he gets 2 spiritual rewards. If he makes a wrong ijtihad, he gets 1 spiritual reward. In this regard, it is wrong to declare these philosophers as heretical innovators or apostates. Additionally, Ibn Rushd discusses Ghazali's and some other Ash'ari theologians' major criticisms of philosophers by mostly showing the complexity of philosophers' arguments. For him, on whether God knows the particulars or not, the philosopher's position is based on the categorical differentiation between God's knowledge and that of human beings. Whether the world is eternal or not was another major debate between theologians and philosophers. Ibn Rushd defines it as a semantic discussion focused on naming. He also defends the philosopher's position by stressing the difficulty in separating time from the universe. Time does not precede the world. Time is something that accompanies motion and bodies. Ibn Rushd takes an elitist position while accusing Ghazali of making a mistake against both religion and philosophy by discussing complex issues in dialectical and rhetorical works to be read by ordinary people. He similarly criticizes the Mu'tazilis and the Ash'aris for turning sophisticated religious interpretations into a matter of dialectical arguments and, furthermore, for teaching them to the masses. To Ibn Rushd, the popularization of these theological debates among the people produced hostile and clashing factions within the Muslim community. Ibn Rushd also offers alternatives to the Ash'ari and Mu'tazili theology schools in certain issues, such as their ways of proving God's existence. For him, one alternative way of proving it is invention. Every invented thing reflects its inventor, all existing entities are invented, and thus existing entities reflect God. The other way is providence, all existing beings are suited to man's existence, and this suitability cannot be due to chance, but indicates a willing agent, God. Ibn Rushd elaborates his criticism of Ghazali at length in The Incoherence of the Incoherence. He particularly criticizes Ghazali's notion of causality. Ibn Rushd notes that as a result of Ghazali's and other Ash'ari's rejection of causality and their definition of God's creation as unpredictable, there would no longer be any permanent knowledge of anything, because Ash'aris suppose God to rule existence like a tyrannical prince, of whom no standard or custom is known to which reference might be made. Ibn Rushd also cites the Quranic verse, "You will never find in God's course any alteration," 33-62, 35-43, 48-23, to emphasize the established order and causality in the world. On the relationship between the divine will and human free will, Ibn Rushd's explanations would be relevant to modern discussions on agent-structure relations. For him, what is referred to as God's decree is the external and internal conditions that constrain human free will. God gives humans faculties to choose between opposite options. Nevertheless, the causes outside and inside of individuals' bodies also affect their will. After the death of Ibn Rushd's patron, Abu Yaqub, his son, Yaqub al-Mansur, r. 1184-99, became ruler. Initially, he followed his father in supporting Ibn Rushd. Nonetheless, in 1195, Yaqub al-Mansur, motivated by the reactionary ulama and their public allies, ordered the burning of Ibn Rushd's books, put him in exile in a small town, and similarly punished other scholars for their engagement in philosophy. Ibn Rushd went into exile for around 2 years, and he died shortly after being exonerated. Ibn Rushd was mostly disregarded or forgotten in Muslim lands, but he profoundly influenced European thought. Jewish philosophers and translators played a pivotal role in the diffusion of his ideas. Besides his treatise on Islamic theology, Islamic jurisprudence, and medicine, we know today 38 commentaries by Ibn Rushd on Aristotle's work. Only 19 of his commentaries have survived as Arabic manuscripts in Arabic characters, 9 have survived as Arabic manuscripts in Hebrew characters, and the rest have survived only as Latin and/or Hebrew translations. That the Muslim world and Europe treated Ibn Rushd's ideas in such divergent ways indicates the beginning of an intellectual reversal between the two realms. The former began to undermine philosophy, while the latter started to appreciate it. After Ibn Rushd, Andalus and Northwest Africa continued to produce great scholars for 2 more centuries. These scholars included Maimonides, circa 1135 to 1204, one of the most important medieval Jewish philosophers. Born in Cordoba, Maimonides lived for a few years in Morocco and eventually settled in Egypt. He tried to bridge Judaism and Aristotelian philosophy. He also wrote treatises on medicine and worked as a physician for Ayyubid rulers, including Saladin. Maimonides was influenced by Farabi, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd and influenced both Jewish and Muslim scholars. Ibn Arabi, 1165 to 1240, was also born in Andalus. He traveled all around Muslim lands, including Morocco, the Arabian Peninsula, Syria, Iraq, and Anatolia. Ibn Arabi's work combines philosophy and Sufism. He defines God as the only reality and human beings as mirrors of God's beautiful names. By the mid-13th century, Cordoba and Seville had fallen to the Reconquista, and Muslim rule in the Iberian Peninsula was limited to Granada under the Nasrid dynasty. Despite its challenging political conditions, Granada remained an impressive example of Islamic civilization in terms of arts and architecture and produced a prominent Sunni jurist, Shatabi, c. 1320-88. Shatabi elaborated the concept of the 5 higher objectives of Islamic law, Maqasid al-Sharia. The 5 higher objectives, as previously formulated by Ghazali, are the protection of religion, of life, of intellect, of progeny, and of property. This formulation is based on the jurisprudential interpretation that people's well-being, maslaha, should be taken as an essential criterion in Islamic law. Ghazali was very cautious not to permit the principle of maslaha to supersede Quranic verses and hadiths. Shatabi, however, attached great importance to maslaha and legitimized many legal exceptions based on that principle. His methodology would reach the point that any ruling potentially could be considered an exception and adapted according to circumstances, even by disregarding a ruling based on a Quranic verse or hadith. In this regard, Shatabi's methodology provides the most flexible understanding of Islamic law, which has increasingly appealed to Muslim modernists since the late 19th century. Another 14th-century Muslim scholar, Ibn Khaldun, has received much more modern academic and political attention than Shatabai or any other Muslim scholar. Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, 1332–1406, has been regarded as a founder of social science as a discipline distinct from religious sciences, philosophy, and natural sciences. In fact, Ibn Khaldun himself also acknowledges that he initiated an independent science with its own peculiar object, that is, human civilization and social organization. Ibn Khaldun was born in Tunisia into a family of Andalusian descent. Having lost his parents and some teachers during the Black Death, he moved to Morocco and then Granada. Ibn Khaldun became advisor of various rulers. His political engagements ended with these rulers' failures. Politically disappointed, he focused on writing a history of the world. Like Shatabai, Ibn Khaldun was a Maliki jurist. In Cairo, where he settled in the last third of his life, the Mamluk authorities appointed him to various posts, such as the chief judge of the Maliki school, professor of law, and head of a prominent Sufi lodge. As a Mamluk representative, he went to Damascus, which at the time was under siege by Timur's army. Ibn Khaldun had a month-long series of conversations with Timur before the latter sacked the city in 1401. The most famous book of Ibn Khaldun is the Muqaddimah, the introduction to his multi-volume world history. The Muqaddimah analyzes complex socio-economic and political causes behind historical events. In this book, Ibn Khaldun develops two concepts of social life: Umran Badawi, rural, simple culture, and Umran Hadari, urban, complex culture. In a nutshell, these concepts capture the dichotomy between nomadic tribes and sedentary people. In a detailed analysis, however, they mark a continuum. Umran Badawi refers to lifestyles of desert nomads, Bedouins, semi-nomads, and the inhabitants of mountains and outlying villages, while Umran Hadari refers to lifestyles of those living in suburban villages, towns, and cities. Sedentary people develop sciences and arts, but they have two main weaknesses. The first is their political and military docility, which grows as the state disarms and subjugates them. The second weakness comes with the luxurious urban lifestyle. Sedentary people have become used to laziness and ease. They are sunk in well-being and luxury. These two characteristics are interrelated. Sedentary people become more militarily dependent on the state as they eat more and become lazier, and vice versa. People of nomadic tribes, in contrast, are used to hard conditions, ready to fight, and likely to be courageous. They have no walls or gates. Therefore, they provide their own defense. They always carry weapons. More importantly, they have strong asabiya, group feeling. Asabiya is the vital factor that restrains people from splitting up and abandoning each other. It is the source of unity and agreement. It accounts for nomads' ability to invade and conquer cities. Nomads have negative characteristics as well. Places that succumb to the Bedouins are quickly ruined, stresses Ibn Khaldun. He defines their natural disposition as the negation and antithesis of civilization, characterized by the tendency to plunder other people's possessions. According to Ibn Khaldun, there is a complex relationship between asabiya and royal authority. On the one hand, the goal of asabiya is to establish royal authority. On the other hand, royal authority eventually weakens the people's asabiya by removing their weapons and subduing them. In his definition, royal authority means to rule by force. In some cases, when their people no longer have asabiya, rulers seem to govern easily. Nonetheless, in general, the weakening of the people's asabiya implies the weakening of the state too. In the short run, despotic dynasties can maintain authority and military might by employing foreign mercenaries and slave soldiers. In the long run, however, their rule deteriorates. In addition to despotism, another major characteristic of a declining dynasty is corruption. Due to its addiction to luxury and spending, the dynasty overtaxes the people. Moreover, it plunders. Its hand reaches out to seize some of the property of the subjects, either through customs duties, or through commercial transactions, or, in some cases, merely by hostile acts directed against property holdings, on some pretext or even with none. The people do not rebel because the dynasty has colored the souls of its subject people with the habit of subservience and submission for so many long years. Finally, the dynasty falls, usually leading to both political and social collapse. The declining sedentary group is replaced by a new nomadic group with strong asabiya. The cycle continues. Ibn Khaldun uses this theory to explain political transformations in Muslim history. Religions, including Islam, may play a unifying role, but they cannot single-handedly shape socio-political events. They need the support of a powerful group with strong asabiyya. When the Abbasids lost their asabiyya, they tried to keep the power by employing Turks and other ethnic groups as soldiers. Later, non-Arab groups with strong asabiyya, such as the Buyids and then the Seljuks, gained control of Baghdad. Finally, nomadic Mongols invaded eastern territories and destroyed the Abbasid Caliphate. The case of the Iberian Peninsula was similar. Once the Umayyads' asabiyya became weak, small principalities divided their territory. Subsequently, a nomadic Berber force with strong asabiyya and religious dynamism, the Almoravids, came and took Andalus under its control. In certain parts of the Muqaddimah, especially the section entitled A Refutation of Philosophy, the corruption of the students of philosophy, Ibn Khaldun criticizes such Muslim philosophers as Farabi and Ibn Sina, particularly for their metaphysical views. Religiously, Ibn Khaldun was more an orthodox Sunni than these philosophers. Methodologically, Ibn Khaldun preferred to make inferences from historical data, unlike these philosophers, who largely relied on syllogism and drew normative conclusions. Yves Lacoste defines Ibn Khaldun as a unique personality who was both an orthodox Muslim and an empirical scientist. Lacoste points out that these two characteristics were complementary and even necessary for Ibn Khaldun to develop a scientific approach independent of Aristotelian, logic and metaphysical philosophy, which dominated sciences at that time. Although Ibn Khaldun criticizes philosophers, his approach also diverges from orthodox Sunni perspectives in some respects. One divergence pertains to the authentication of hadiths. Orthodox scholars generally check two things: 1. Whether a hadith contradicts apparent meanings of Quranic verses, and 2. Whether the person who transmits the hadith is reliable. Ibn Khaldun argues that rational criticism should have priority over criticism of transmitters regarding hadiths and other historical reports. It is necessary to investigate whether it is possible that the reported facts could have happened. This is more important than, and has priority over, personality criticism. Ibn Khaldun's general theory is structuralist, in a sense that it explains events through broad geographical, socio-economic, and political factors, rather than the roles of particular actors or ideas. He does not depict history as a struggle between belief and unbelief, or between good and evil. For him, sedentary and nomadic groups are interdependent entities, which jointly constitute dynamics of social history in a dialectical manner. To explain the state of Muslims' intellectual life, Ibn Khaldun again uses a structuralist perspective. He regards scholarship as a consequence of certain socio-political conditions, particularly the existence or absence of sedentary culture. There had been a flourishing of sciences in eastern territories, while Iraq, Khorasan, and Transoxiana retained their sedentary culture. Yet, when those cities fell into ruins, sedentary culture, which God has devised for the attainment of sciences and crafts, disappeared from them. Consequently, scholarship disappeared from among the Persians, who were now engulfed by the desert attitude. He refers to Tusi as the last great Persian scholar. He also mentions Taftazani as a great scholar who indicates that in his region, Transoxiana, sedentary culture still survived in some cities. In the same vein, in Andalus and northwest Africa, sciences decreased with the decrease of civilization. Ibn Khaldun appreciates the Cairo of his times as the great center of Islam, the paramount example of sedentary culture, and a fount of scholarship. Nonetheless, after his death, Ibn Khaldun's work did not have much influence even in Cairo, let alone other parts of the Muslim world. Beginning in the 17th century, Ottoman analysts of imperial decline became interested in the Muqaddimah, but they focused almost exclusively on its explanation of the dynastic life cycle. No famous thinker has suffered such long and strange neglect as Ibn Khaldun, writes Saunders. It was his misfortune to live when Arabic culture, of which he was so bright an ornament, was in full decline, and Western Europe had ceased to borrow from it. Ibn Khaldun was a lost opportunity for Muslims to revive their waning intellectual dynamism. Sufism. Sufism replacing philosophy. The process of discrediting philosophers in the Muslim world that began in the 11th century continued in subsequent centuries. Even Ibn Khaldun strongly criticized philosophers, as previously noted. The ulama and the Sufis filled the vacuum left by the gradual disappearance of philosophers. With its syncretic and flexible discourses, Sufism became popular among certain segments of Muslim elites and masses, who saw madrasa-centered orthodox scholarship as rigid and tedious. Sufism's mixture with poetry was also a major reason for its popularity. Another appealing aspect of Sufism has been its esotericism. According to Hussain, the Sufi claim of mystical knowledge was a way of bypassing the censorship of the ulama. The concealment of knowledge gradually became a pattern for all thinkers who did not conform to the narrow range approved by the official ulama. As a result, the more imaginative sides of intellectual culture in Islam tended to become esoteric. In this context, some eminent Sufis such as Ibn Arabi, died in 1240, developed philosophical thought under the name of Sufism. Nonetheless, Fazlur Rahman, Jabri, and several other modern critics have seen the enduring influence of Sufism on Muslim intellectual life as predominantly negative for two main reasons. First, to Sufism's critics, while the philosophy of the philosophers had been rational, the philosophy of the Sufis was mystical. Sufism has emphasized mystical knowledge, irfan, which is unveiled to illuminated hearts, at the expense of reason, declaring the latter to be fallible and misleading. Second, the Sufi understanding of spiritual hierarchy is seen as contradicting Sunni Islam's original message of egalitarianism. The Sufi sheikhs have claimed a monopoly over the Quranic terms wali, singular, and awliya, plural, meaning friends, of God. This dynamic is similar to the ulama's monopolization of broad Quranic terms ilm, science, and ulama, those who are knowledgeable, by reducing the former to Islamic studies and the latter to themselves. The Sufi sheikhs did not stop there. They have even argued for the existence of a perfect man of the qutb, spiritual, pole, at the top of the spiritual hierarchy. Hence, the duty of ordinary Muslims was to follow this perfect man. Sufism's hierarchical outlook was not confined to spiritual matters and contributed to the authoritarian tendencies in Muslim socio-political life, as explored in the following section. Sufism and the state. In addition to allying with the ulama, Sunni rulers and officials such as Nizam al-Mulk, Nur al-Din, and Saladin patronized Sufis. Their patronage helped these rulers both keep Sufis under control and benefit from their popular legitimacy. In the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Caliph Nasir, art 1180–1225, tried to reassert Abbasid religio-political authority by building close alliances with the ulama and Sufi sheikhs. He also restructured Futawa orders, men's clubs organized around codes of honor, under his leadership. As one component of this broader support for Sufism, Nasir provided a prominent Sufi sheikh, Umar Shirawardi, with an official position. In order to strengthen Nasir's network, especially following the Mongol invasions, Shirawardi visited Anatolia. He arranged a meeting between the Sultan of the Anatolian Seljuks, Alaeddin Kikabad, r. 1220–37, and the eminent Sufi Sheikh Najm al-Din Razi, known as Daya, 1177–1256. Daya had fled the Mongols from Khorasan to Anatolia. He submitted his Sufi compendium, The Path of God's Bondsman from Origin to Return, to the Sultan. The path provides a Sufi framework for the orthodox Sunni synthesis. It condemns the philosophers for their metaphysical views. It particularly criticizes Omar Khayyam for his poems questioning the meaning of life in an unorthodox manner. The path reflects the influence of the Sasanian notion of social stratification in which the rulers and the clergy constitute the dominant classes, while the merchants are subordinated and the independent scholars eliminated. The path follows this stratification and establishes the following social hierarchy: kings, viziers and deputies, ulama, jurists, judges, and preachers, holders of wealth, farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. The path quotes several fabricated hadiths to justify such a hierarchy. It depicts kings as sacred people. The Prophet, upon whom be God's peace and blessings, said, "The king is the shadow of God upon earth." The ulama have lower but still sacred status. The Prophet may be thought of as saying, "What need henceforth for prophets? For each of the scholars of my religion shall be equal to a prophet?" Sheikhs are also presented as sacred. The Prophet said, "The sheikh among his following is like the Prophet among his people." Last but not least, it repeats a version of the famous fabrication. The Prophet said, "Justice and kingship are twins." The path was widely read in Muslim lands and promoted hierarchical political and religious views. Modern investigations discovered a large number of copies of its original and translations in Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and China. It exerted great influence in Turkish Anatolia, the land of its composition, in both the Persian original and a much-read Turkish translation made in the 15th century. Versions of it were dedicated to two Ottoman sultans, Murad II and Bayezid II, the father and son of Fatih, respectively. Another important work that promoted similar themes was The Mirror for Princes, written in Persian by the famous poet Sa'di, 1209–91. Sa'di emphasizes the need for a strong connection between the ruler, the ulama, and the Sufi orders. He writes, "The ruler must treat religious leaders and clergymen with reverence, offer them a prominent seat, and rule as they deem it advisable so that kingship is in compliance with the Sharia and not vice versa." While listing the most important tasks of the state, he first mentions the construction of mosques and houses of dervishes, followed by bridges, water reservoirs, and roadside wells. The hierarchical understandings of state, society and state-religion relations were not merely reflected in certain Sufi writings. As the next section will show, they characterized Muslim political thought between the 12th and 14th centuries. Muslim political thought. If one thinks about some medieval ulama whose political views have influenced Muslims into the 21st century, the three most prominent examples would be Mawardi, Ghazali, and Ibn Taymiyyah. I already covered Mawardi and Ghazali, whose ideas were shaped by the political conditions in Iraq-Iran mostly in the 11th century. Ibn Taymiyyah, 1263–1328, lived about 2 centuries later, in Egypt, Syria. His radical views about declaring some heterodox groups, Alawites and Druzes, and Muslims who did not observe Islamic law, Mongol rulers who converted to Islam, as unbelievers and thus people who could be killed, were informed by the experience of war between his country, the Mamluk Sultanate, and its enemies of the Mongols, the Crusaders, and disobedient heterodox Muslims. Beyond the issue of violence, Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas have been influential in the formation of contemporary Salafism. As a neo-Hanbali, Ibn Taymiyyah attached importance to literal understandings of the Quran and Hadiths, thus he emphasized the text at the expense of reason while interpreting Islamic law. Ibn Taymiyyah attacked those who advocated the use of logic, including not only philosophers such as Ibn Sina, but also theologians such as Ghazali and Razi. His criticisms unsurprisingly targeted Sufis and Shias too. In his influential Al-Siyasa al-Shari'a fi Isla al-Ra'iyya wa al-Ra'iyya, Sharia-based governance and reforming both the ruler and his flock, Ibn Taymiyyah emphasizes the importance of the ulama-state alliance. He depicts political authority as an absolute necessity. 60 years with a despotic ruler are better than one night without a ruler. He also notes that political authority and religious authority are dependent on each other. If political authority is isolated from religion, or religion from political authority, then the people's order would be destroyed. In this regard, Ibn Taymiyyah interprets the phrase Al-Ilm in the Quran, 459, "O you who believe, obey God and obey the Messenger and those in authority, Al-Ilm, among you," as referring to two leading classes, the Wumara, rulers and officials, and the ulama. This view marked a departure from Mawardi's theory of the ideal caliphate, in which a single imam represents both political and religious authority. Ibn Taymiyyah's shift from the ideal of caliphate to a more realistic notion of ulama-state alliance seems to have resulted from the abolishment of the Abbasid Caliphate and the Mamluk Sultan's military-based political authority. It is not a coincidence that another famous Mamluk jurist of that time, Ibn Jama, 1241–1333, held similar views on the political importance of the ulama. Ibn Taymiyyah's harsh and wide-ranging criticisms earned him many enemies. As a result, he was imprisoned several times and eventually died in prison. Some of his ideas, such as his criticism of Sufism and his literalism, mostly remained peripheral until the 20th century, while his stress on the ulama-state alliance has continually attracted attention. Ibn Rushd and other philosophers offered alternative political views, but they gained neither the support of the masses nor the approval of those in power. In his commentary on Plato's Republic, Ibn Rushd endorses and even expands the Platonic view on women's socio-political participation. He notes that women can hold any socio-political status, including those of philosophers and rulers. Ibn Rushd even argues that keeping women out of socio-political life hindered prosperity in the Muslim cities of Andalus. In these writings, Ibn Rushd challenges both the established notion of gender relations in his own Muslim society and certain views of Aristotle on this issue. The competence of women is unknown, however, in these cities, since they are only taken for procreation and hence are placed at the service of their husbands and confined to procreation, upbringing, and suckling. This nullifies their other activities. Since women in these cities are not prepared with respect to any of the human virtues, they frequently resemble plants. Their being a burden upon the men is one of the causes of the poverty of these cities. Women should be trained in the same way through music and gymnastic. Nonetheless, such egalitarian views on gender relations never became popular in Muslim societies until the 20th century. Instead, patriarchal, if not misogynistic, views, including those of Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah, as well as those of some philosophers such as Tusi, represented the mainstream. Ibn Rushd's views on education and political regimes in his commentary on Plato's Republic were also completely ignored by Muslims. On education, Ibn Rushd approvingly paraphrases Plato's emphasis on teaching philosophy, gymnastics, and music to students. On political regimes, Ibn Rushd briefly analyzes early Islamic history through the lens of the Platonic framework. While explaining Plato's notion of the transformation from the virtuous regime, based on reason and wisdom, to timocracy, based on spiritedness and honor, and then to three other regimes, based on appetite and desires: oligarchy, the rule of the wealthy few; democracy, the rule of the poor majority; and tyranny. Ibn Rushd refers to cases from early Islamic history. For him, the case of the governance of the Arabs in early times, that is, the rule of the Prophet and the four caliphs, used to imitate the virtuous governance. Afterward, the Arabs were transformed into timocrats in the days of Muawiyah. Likewise, he briefly explains the political achievements and failures of the Almoravids and the Almohads as a transformation from regimes based on wisdom to regimes based on honor and desire. Ibn Rushd explains that he commented on Plato's Republic because Aristotle's book on governance has not yet fallen into our hands. Interestingly, Aristotle's Politics was not translated into Arabic until 1957. Scholars have debated the reasons for this delay. Politics translation into Latin and then vernacular languages, beginning in the mid-13th century, had a substantial impact on the transformation of Western European thought, particularly on its conceptualization of citizenship, political community, and the common good. In short, the jurisprudential approach, represented by Ibn Taymiyyah, was dominant, while the philosophical approach, represented by Ibn Rushd, was mostly marginal in Muslim political thought between the 12th and 14th centuries. The ulama class had dozens, if not hundreds, of madrasas and thousands of members to disseminate its ideas, whereas the philosophers lacked institutional and financial bases except for arbitrary political patronage, particularly after the weakening of the merchant class, which had previously supported both philosophers and independent Islamic scholars. A third approach was the advice, or mirrors for princes, literature. It was much more eclectic and pragmatic than the jurisprudential and philosophical alternatives. Works of this category combine Sasanian realpolitik, Greek philosophy, and Islamic political thought in various degrees. Tusi's philosophical book, Nazarian Ethics, could be categorized as a book of advice literature. Originally it was intended to be a Persian adaptation of Miskawayh's book on ethics, but it subsequently became an important book in its own right. The main sources Tusi used were Miskawayh and Aristotle, on ethics, Ibn Sina and Bryson, on household management, and Farabi and Plato, on politics. Tusi's synthesis of Platonic, Sasanian, and Islamic ideas is visible in the following paragraph about the ideal polity and the religion-state brotherhood. The people of the virtuous city, however, albeit diversified throughout the world, are in reality agreed. In their close-knit affection they are like one individual, as the religious legislator says, peace be upon him. Muslims are, like, a single hand against all others, and the believers are as one soul. Their rulers, who are the regulators of the world, have control of the enactments of laws and of the most expedient measures in daily life. This is the reason for the interdependence of faith and kingship, as expressed by the emperor of the Iranians, the philosopher of the Persians, Ardashir Babak. Religion and kingship are twins, neither being complete without the other. Religion is the base and kingship the support, just as a foundation without support avails nothing, while a support without foundation falls into ruin, so religion without kingship is profitless, and kingship without faith is easily broken. Tusi's Nazarian ethics influenced the elite in the Middle East and India for centuries. Ghiyaduddin Bahrani, 1285–1357, a Muslim political thinker in the Delhi Sultanate, produced another important book of advice literature. He was an unapologetic defender of the Sasanian notion of realpolitik. For Barani, governance was inherently immoral. Thus, it should be designed by Sasanian traditions, instead of Islamic ethical principles. But just as the eating of carrion, though prohibited, is yet permitted in time of dire need, similarly the customs and traditions of the pagan emperors of Iran and the crown and the throne, high palaces, court ceremonials, asking people to prostrate themselves before the king, collecting treasures, misappropriating properties, putting people to death on grounds of state policy, spending recklessly without any right, should from the viewpoint of truth and the correct faith, be considered like the eating of a carrion in time of dire need. Know well that kingship is not possible without following the traditions of the emperors of Iran, and it is known to all religious scholars that these traditions are opposed to the traditions of the Prophet and to his mode of life and living. In the same vein, even Ibn Khaldun justifies certain Sasanian political customs in Muslim states. The decisions of the ruler, he notes, as a rule, deviate from what is right. Thus, he explains how various Sasanian political attitudes replaced Islamic ones. The Prophet Muhammad and the four caliphs received the bay'ah, a handshake between the leader and the person who renders his or her oath of allegiance. The Prophet received bay'ah from both men and women. Bay'ah implied a contractual relationship, resembling a handshaking for a trade deal, in the words of Ibn Khaldun, something like the action of buyer and seller. Later, Muslims adopted the Persian custom of greeting kings by kissing the earth, or their hand, their foot, or the lower hem of their garment. This behavior replaced the handshake which was originally used, because shaking hands with everybody meant that the ruler lowered himself and made himself cheap, things that are detrimental to leadership and the dignity of the royal position. In general, the methodological and theoretical approaches of Ibn Khaldun could have lifted Muslim political thought to a much higher level had they not been ignored for centuries. His empirical methodology could have fixed the main problem with the ulama's literalist epistemology, the exclusive focus on the text without consideration of the context. Moreover, Ibn Khaldun's social scientific theoretical approach, which explains cause and effect relations, could have offered novel perspectives on socio-political analysis beyond those provided by philosophy or advice literature. In a narrow sense, Ibn Khaldun's theoretical framework based on Asabiyya became irrelevant by the 16th century as a result of the Ottomans' and other states' effective use of gunpowder against various nomadic horsemen. Later, Western European states developed even more disciplined military forces armed with more sophisticated weapons. Furthermore, nationalism and national armies made urban people militarily much stronger than Ibn Khaldun could have imagined. In a broader sense, however, Ibn Khaldun's framework may still be seen as relevant for understanding such modern phenomena as peasant revolts, center-periphery relations, and migration. While discussing political issues, Muslim scholars generally did not systematically explore economic affairs. An exception was, again, Ibn Khaldun. He stresses the interconnection between political sociology and economics while also elaborating certain rules of economics. Although Ibn Khaldun might have had a few forerunners who studied the economy as a subject in and of itself, he still was the first and, until the 19th century, the only Muslim thinker to develop systematic ideas on economics. He argues that extravagant spending weakens dynasties and that despotic dynasties overtax to fund extravagancy. Nevertheless, in a declining dynasty, higher tax rates do not mean higher revenues, instead, they lead to lower revenues. Jean Boulakia defines Ibn Khaldun as a pioneer theorist of production, value, money, prices, determined by demand and supply, distribution, the population cycle, and the public finance cycle. Joseph Spengler notes that Ibn Khaldun's economic views embrace market, price, monetary, supply, and demand phenomena, and hinting at some of the macroeconomic relations stressed by Lord Keynes 6 centuries later. For Spengler, Ibn Khaldun's economic views did not lead to the creation of economics as an independent discipline because they were too deeply embedded into his general sociological analysis, which intended to explain the behavior over time of interrelated economic and non-economic phenomena. Otherwise, he could have led economic inquiry to be carried forward effectively in the Muslim world, at least in the absence of oppressive governmental or ecclesiastical action. Indeed, governmental and clerical suppression of critical inquiry into politics and the economy became increasingly dominant in the Muslim world. This problem was directly linked to the trivialization of not only economic thought but also the merchant class at the hands of the State Ulama Alliance. Marginalization of merchants. I have explained how the Seljuk model of ulama-state alliance gradually spread from the eastern territories toward Egypt and Syria under the Ayyubids and then the Mamluks. This alliance weakened social roles of merchants, who had previously funded certain philosophers and independent, that is, not state-servant, Islamic scholars. Another dimension of the Seljuk model was the IKTA system of land revenue assignments. In Egypt, the IKTA system was developed under the Ayyubids and further institutionalized under the Mamluks. It became a foundation for the Mamluk centralization and militarization of the economy. Particularly during the second period of Mamluk rule, central state policies marginalized merchants. Following the Mongol invasion of the eastern territories, including the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, the Mamluk Sultanate, which ruled Egypt and Syria from the mid-13th to the early 16th century, gained central importance in the Muslim world. In this regard, the Mamluk case is crucial to understanding the ulama-state alliance and state-merchant relations in this period. The Mamluks officially sanctioned the idea of the equality and full orthodoxy of the four Sunni jurisprudential schools as never before. Under the Mamluks, Lapidus stresses, the ulama were not only the undisputed interpreters of the divine law but also the administrators of the community's familial, commercial, educational, and legal affairs. The weakening of private economic enterprises coincided with the strengthening of Mamluk control over religion. Muslim religious life was rebuilt around formal schools and endowed properties, and was increasingly subordinated to state control. The Black Death in 1348-9 killed about one-third of the population of Egypt and Syria. The Black Death affected almost the entire Old World, and its death rate was even higher, around 2/5 of the population, in Europe. Plague continually struck the Mamluk territories until the early 15th century and, according to Michael Dahls, had a cumulative effect far greater than that of the Black Death itself. Dahls narrates an anecdote about the plague of 1429-30. The Mamluk Sultan of the time gathered the ulama in Cairo for consultation. A judge complained that the Sultan himself had a production and trade monopoly on certain goods, including sugarcane and spices, which led to substantial hardship for merchants. In response, the Sultan merely ordered the judges and emirs, officials, to instruct the people to be penitent and to increase their pious deeds. This anecdote shows how the Mamluk Sultan disregarded the worsening conditions of merchants even when the issue was raised by a member of the ulama. The Mamluks subordinated Karimi merchants, who had conducted Egypt-based intercontinental trade for centuries. In certain cases of fiscal need, the Mamluk state seized money from Karimi merchants through forced loans or forced purchases. Fiscal abuses were so common as to be natural, writes Lapidus. Beyond state needs, personal corruption of Mamluk officials caused problems for merchants too. In this regard, what protection merchants could obtain depended on patronage, appeals to higher officials against the abuses of lesser ones, the intercession of the religious notables, and above all on bribery and compromise. In the 15th century, the Mamluk state's control of the economy tightened even further. The Karimi merchants were largely marginalized. In general, an increasing number of merchants began to serve as the Sultan's agents, and numerous officials started to function in commerce. In other words, giant steps were taken toward the fuller assimilation of the merchants into the state and the reduction of the independent merchant class, leading to the decline of the upper bourgeoisie. The restrictions on private property led to an enormous expansion of waqf properties. In particular, officials tended to endow their properties as waqfs in order to protect them from state seizure. Ibn Khaldun observes that in Egypt, the Turkish emirs, officials, under the Turkish dynasty, Ayyubids and early Mamluks, were afraid that their ruler might proceed against their descendants, because chicanery and confiscation are always to be feared from royal authority. Thus, they built a great many colleges, hermitages, and monasteries, and endowed them with mortmain endowments that yielded income. Some intended that their children would participate in these endowments, either as administrators or by having some other share in them, while others were inclined to do good deeds and hoped for a heavenly reward for their aspirations and actions. While increased waqf funding supported more students and teachers, as Timur Quran emphasizes, these measures also led to economic inefficiency and stagnation. This economic stagnancy can be deduced from Schatzmiller's data. Analyzing historical documents, including urban market administrator guidelines, for example, Hisba manuals, written in Iraq, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Andalus, she compares the period between the 8th and 11th centuries with that between the 12th and 15th centuries. From the first period to the second, the number of occupational terms pertaining to commerce almost remained stable, from 233 to 220, whereas the number pertaining to bureaucracy and military increased from 97 to 303, and the number pertaining to education, law, and religion increased from 33 to 180, see Table 5.1. The changing numbers indicate the higher degree of specialization and division of labor in the sectors related to the officials and ulama in comparison to the sectors related to the merchants. The hardship of Muslim merchants within the Mamluk Sultanate coincided with their increasing competition with European merchants. In the 12th century, both the growing European markets and Crusaders' invasion of Levantine port cities helped Italian merchants become active in the Eastern Mediterranean trade. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Italian merchants expanded their influence in Eastern Mediterranean ports. Relatedly, in Western Mediterranean trade, Italian, French, Catalan, and Portuguese merchants became effective in the 12th century and dominant in the 13th and 14th centuries. Why were European merchants able to eventually surpass their Muslim competitors in Mediterranean trade? One way of answering this question is to follow Avner Greif's well-known comparison between Maghribi, North African, and Genoese traders in the 11th and 12th centuries. Greif claims while the Maghribi Jewish traders belonged to a collectivist culture of Muslim North Africa, the Genoese traders were products of a more individualist Western European culture. Collectivist culture promoted reputation-based community enforcement mechanisms at the expense of formal institutions, whereas individualist culture generated and strengthened formal institutions. For Greif, this cultural difference explains how European traders became more successful than their Muslim competitors in the long run. I have two main reservations with respect to Greif's argument. First, Greif provides sufficient evidence for neither his characterization of North African Jewish/Muslim culture as collectivist nor the weakness of formal institutions in North Africa at the time. Schatzmiller stresses Greif's lack of evidence on collectivist characterization and shows fairly strong formal institutions in a North African case. Schatzmiller refers to 11th century legal documents on commercial and maritime issues in Tunisia, which indicate that legal principles and court decisions were enforced, and rules on partnerships and contracts were codified and enforced throughout. Jeremy Edwards and Shilak Ogilvy have also re-evaluated the ways Greif interpreted his main source for the Maghribi traders of the Janaza documents discovered in an old Cairo synagogue. They reached an opposite conclusion: the Maghribi traders combined reputation-based sanctions with legal mechanisms, in ways that resemble the practices of medieval European merchants. We find no evidence that the Maghribi traders had more collectivist cultural beliefs than their European counterparts. Second, Greif's references to religious differences, intended to explain the alleged individualist/communitarian dichotomy, are not convincing. He argues that Christianity during that period placed the individual rather than his social group at the center of its theology, and that it stressed the individual's salvation as personal and private affair. Nonetheless, salvation in Islam has been a personal and private affair too. Unlike Catholicism, Islam never accepted confessing one's sin to a priest. There is no reason to think that Islam was any less individualistic than Catholicism. Thus, the increasing success of Italian Catholic merchants vis-a-vis their North African Jewish/Muslim competitors requires some other explanation. My analysis has shown that the answer lies in the marginalization of Muslim/Jewish merchants by the Ulamad State Alliance. In contrast, the Catholic merchants began to gain better positions in the republics of Genoa and Venice, as well as several other parts of Western Europe, due to changing class relations, as I will elaborate later. Given these circumstances, Muslim merchants could not respond to their European competitors in a reciprocal way. Muslim merchants failed to notice the evolving markets in Northern Europe. In fact, even intellectually, Muslims were never sufficiently interested in Western Europe. There is no noteworthy reference to even the Crusaders in the writings of Ghazali, who traveled to Jerusalem right before the Crusades and lived long enough to write after its invasion, or the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun, who was, after all, a historian analyzing invasions. There is one famous paragraph in the Muqaddimah about the development of philosophical education in Western Europe, which seems to be an exception that proves the rule. While Muslims were mostly indifferent to Western Europeans, the latter were experiencing substantial transformations. Transformation of Western Europe. March Bloch analyzes two periods of medieval Western Europe. The first period begins with the collapse of the Carolingian Empire, 800 to 88, and was characterized by the weakening of central political authority. During this period, which lasted to the mid-11th century, population density was low, communication and transportation opportunities were restricted, and commerce was limited. Circulation of gold depended on Arab and Byzantine coins and imitations of them. The second period lasted from the mid-11th to the late 13th century. During this period, Western Europe experienced agricultural development, population growth, strengthening of monarchical powers, improvement in transportation, circulation of money, and expansion of commerce. Merchants, who previously had only an inferior status, became more numerous and indispensable for the developing urban life. In 1252 an indigenous Western European gold coin began to be minted. Fernand Braudel regarded this monetary development as a landmark event. If one had to choose a date to mark the end of Europe's apprenticeship and trade to the cities of Islam and Byzantium, that of 1252 seems as good a date as any, if indeed what was essentially a slow evolution can be dated. In addition to urbanization and economic growth, another transformation in Western Europe was the beginning of institutional balance of power, diversity, and differentiation. The 11th century reform of the Catholic Church was an important part of this broader institutional development. A well-established perception about the differences between Catholicism and Islam is that the former essentially embraces religion-state separation whereas the latter essentially rejects it. Defenders of this perception provide some textual evidence for their position. To show religion-state separation in Christianity, they quote a biblical phrase, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's," Luke 20 verse 25. To argue that such a separation is not possible in Islam, they refer to the above-mentioned fabricated hadith about religion-state brotherhood. I have shown that a certain level of separation between religious and political authorities was maintained in early Islamic history. Hence, the ulama-state alliance is not an essential aspect of Islam, but a historical construct of the 11th century and its aftermath. Similarly, religion and state relations in the history of Western Christianity were too complex to be explained by a single biblical phrase. As the history of France exemplifies, the Catholic Church's struggles with political authorities continued even in the 20th century. Interestingly, developments in the 11th century also shaped the historical construction of church-state separation in Western Christianity. In the 11th century, several members of the Catholic hierarchy claimed superiority over kings. While certain kings tried to dominate the church, neither side had a clearly defined notion of church-state separation. The struggles between the clergy and royal power at that time included both doctrinal debate and military conflict. Cardinal Humbert, who also played a leading role in the Great Schism between the Catholic and Orthodox churches, was a principal defender of the Catholic Church's supremacy over royal authority. He argued, just as the soul excels the body and commands it, so the priestly dignity excels the royal. Beyond such statements, the Church took initiatives to restrict lay rulers' interventions in ecclesiastical appointments. In 1059, the Pope's election by cardinals was institutionalized. Henry IV, King of Germany, and later Holy Roman Emperor, however, sought the authority to appoint bishops. The Church responded with additional reforms called either the 11th century Reform or Gregorian Reform, named after Pope Gregory VII, to maintain the Church's institutional independence from political authorities. In 1075, Gregory issued the Dictates of the Pope, which asserted the Pope's supreme status. Its 27 articles include these two, that the Pope is the only one whose feet are to be kissed by all princes, and that he may depose emperors. Henry did not accept the reform and deposed Gregory, while Gregory excommunicated Henry more than once. Other struggles pitted popes and monarchs against each other in the early 12th century, resulting, for example, in a pope's imprisonment by a German monarch. According to Brian Tierney, during all these struggles, kings tried to found a royal theocracy, while popes tried to establish a papal theocracy. Yet both endeavors largely failed, neither side was able to fully subdue the other. This mutual failure institutionalized the coexistence of the church and royal authority as two separate entities. Another transformation that led to institutional diversity and differentiation in Western Europe was the establishment of universities. Latin translations of Arabic sources became a component of these universities' curricula. Muslim influence on Western Europe. Western Europeans interacted with Muslims in various ways, including conquest and commerce. Muslim influence on Western Europeans may be traced by words in European languages with Arabic origins, for example, admiral, alchemy, alcohol, algebra, checkmate, giraffe, guitar, mattress, saffron, sugar, and syrup. Between 700 and 1100, Muslims developed the cultivation of various new crops, many of which spread to Europe and whose English names, artichoke, cotton, lemon, orange, and spinach, originally come from Arabic. In terms of commerce, according to Brodel, anything in Western capitalism of imported origin undoubtedly came from Islam. He writes, the long-distance trade of early European capitalism, carried on by the Italian city-states, was not an inheritance from the Roman Empire. Instead, it inherited the model created by Muslims. In terms of technology, paper production was imported from Muslim lands to Christian Europe through Andalus. Some Muslim paper mills fell to the Catholic states during the Reconquista. The first European paper mill outside the Iberian Peninsula was established near Rome in the late 13th century, about 5 centuries after the first paper mill opened in Baghdad. Paper mills were established in other parts of Western Europe even later, in the 14th century in France and Germany, and the late 15th century in England. Muslim scholarly influence on Europe flowed through the translation of Arabic books into Latin and Hebrew. The Iberian Peninsula, including Toledo, which was reconquered by Catholics in 1085, was a center for such translations. Translation of Arabic works continued in some other parts of Europe, such as southern France, in the 12th and 13th centuries. Translated Arabic books included both original Muslim contributions and Arabic translations of Greek books. Despite the increasing number of translations, Western European libraries still had limited numbers of books at that time. In the 13th century, Latin and Hebrew translations of Ibn Rushd's commentaries on Aristotle exerted a strong influence on various European thinkers, such as Thomas Aquinas, d. 1274. Ibn Rushd's influence was so deep that Catholic clergy took action against it, by condemning Ibn Rushd and his followers the Averroists, in several cases from the 13th to the 16th century. Ibn Rushd's appearances in both Dante's The Divine Comedy, written in the 14th century, and Raphael's The School of Athens, painted in the 16th century, indicate his fame among the European elite. Newly established universities were essential in circulating the thought of Ibn Rushd, Aristotle, and others in Western Europe. The introduction of Aristotle's ideas by scholars such as Aquinas, teaching at the University of Paris, transformed European scholarship. The number of European universities kept increasing. When 1300, it was 20, in 1400, it was 44, and in 1500, it reached 66. European universities differed from Muslim madrasas in several respects. While European universities increasingly taught more secular subjects and became open to new ideas, madrasas were focused more on religious education and defending the tradition. Universities had strong institutional bases and issued institutional licenses. Madrasas, by contrast, were based on personal relationships. Each professor was granting personal licenses, ijazas, to certify his students' expertise to teach particular books and/or issue legal opinions. Institutionalization helped universities become stronger against the pressures of the political and religious authorities, whereas relatively uninstitutionalized madrasas remained weak against such pressures. In sum, many facets of Western European development are from the cultivation of new crops to intercontinental trade, and from paper production to the engagement with Aristotelian philosophy, bear the deep imprint of Muslim influence. Conclusion. From the 12th to the 14th century, Muslims suffered devastating invasions, by the Crusaders, Mongols, and Timurids. Nonetheless, Muslims recovered geopolitically after these invasions by defeating Crusaders, converting Mongols, and establishing powerful empires. The truly enduring negative effects of these invasions were their contributions to the cementing of the Ulamate-State alliance. These invasions highlighted the need for survival and order, strengthening the military elites and their alliance with the ulama at the expense of philosophers and merchants throughout the Muslim world, particularly in Syria and Egypt. The marginalization of philosophers did not lead to a complete lack of major Muslim scholars throughout these 3 centuries. This period witnesses several important Muslim thinkers, from Ibn Rushd to Ibn Khaldun. However, these scholars were either persecuted or ignored. Ibn Taymiyyah too experienced persecution. Nonetheless, his concept of the rulers and the ulama jointly holding public authority was the established norm under the Mamluks. Some prominent Sufi thinkers, such as Ibn Arabi, partially filled the vacuum created by the elimination of philosophers. These Sufi thinkers influenced both the elites and the masses in the Muslim world, with their emphasis on mystical knowledge, as well as their justification of spiritual and socio-political hierarchy. Between the 12th and 14th centuries, hierarchy and stratification replaced the more egalitarian socio-political structure in early Islamic history. Socio-political hierarchy became a major problem in the most important Muslim state of that time, the Mamluk Sultanate. To use Ibn Khaldun's theoretical framework, the Ulamad-state alliance under Mamluk rule imposed obedience on the people by using both state power and religion, and thus turned the people into docile bodies without asabiyya, the group feeling to determine their own political destiny. The ulama monopolized the authority to interpret Islam, used waqf funds, and held judicial and other official positions. In exchange for these privileges, the ulama legitimized the Mamluk rulers' acts, even the seizure of private properties and the levying of extraordinary taxes. The ulama were supposed to function as social leaders. Instead, by cooperating with the Mamluk military elite, the ulama delegitimized resistance against corrupt and oppressive rulers. This religio-political structure was undoubtedly elitist. Nikki Keddie argues that, from the 12th century on, the elite's domination of the masses in the Middle East was visible even in the nature of its manufactures. For her, the region became increasingly known for the complex production of luxury goods, which indicates that it moved away from its earlier, more egalitarian phase and that manufacture was increasingly controlled by rulers and the wealthy. During this period, Western Europe underwent profound transformations. Increasing agricultural production and population growth led to the development of commerce. These processes contributed to the emergence of merchants and artisans/craftsmen as important urban classes, alongside the already influential classes of the military, aristocracy and the clergy. Institutionally, this era witnessed diversification. The balance of power between the Catholic Church and monarchs became institutionalized. Universities were established and supported the flourishing of Aristotelian philosophy, which was initially transmitted to Europe through Arabic translations. This chapter has emphasized that the essentialist argument about the inherent difference between Islam's and Christianity's relations with state authority is inaccurate. The 11th century was a critical juncture in the historical construction of both the Ulamad-state alliance and the Muslim world and church-state separation in Western Christianity. These historical constructions, together with the marginalization of merchants and philosophers in the Muslim world, in contrast to the emergence of an influential merchant class and the establishment of universities in Western Europe, would have long-lasting effects on these two cultural zones, as will be explored in subsequent chapters.